This is not a land acknowledgement. An acknowledgement often states that we should remember the indigenous inhabitants of a place as if they are no longer in existence, no longer living in resistance to colonization and empire, no longer in reciprocal relationship with the land and all its inhabitants, two-legged, four-legged, rooted and otherwise, no longer teaching that we are all not meant to be apart from nature, but that we are each a part of nature. This is not an acknowledgement. In the traditions of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and Abya Yala, we offer instead a welcome. Welcome to the Great Lakes Cuyahoga River watershed. Indigenous peoples are not ancient history, but are still here, still existing, resisting, and protecting our most sacred relations, including the stewardship of Mother Earth, also known as Pachamama, Madre Tierra, Abya Yala, Turtle Island. Though the federal government refuses to recognize any tribes in this state, these are unceded lands, home of the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederacy, Ofo, Saponi, Tutelo, Catawba, Shawanawaki, Wyandot, Lenape, Mohican, Kickapoo, Miami, Mississauga, Kaskaskia, the Ashanibeg Confederacy in Moskouten, Neutral, and Erie. Hundreds of tribes and over 1,000 natives call Ohio home. Thank you. Welcome.
So welcome all. I'm Francis Chiappa from Peace Action. That was Don Bryant, who is our president of Peace Action. We are resuming from the background behind me, which was the rain on Sunday. And we're glad that we can have a dry place to present this today. So I'm going to change the background to a nice Lake Erie sunset, and we'll go on from there. I would like to begin by introducing Clarissa Jacobsons. Clarissa is a book artist, painter, and published poet whose visual and written art is strongly inspired by her Lithuanian heritage and history during World War II. Her father survived several Nazi camps, even the Stalingrad Gulag, and miraculously was released in 1950. In Chicago, she was labeled a Nazi and a DP, or displaced person. She shares some of this in her new book, Baltic Amber in a Chest. Clarissa.
Thank you very much. And this is my new book, Baltic Amber in a Chest. It came out this year, 2023, and it took years of research and going through letters that were handwritten by my parents. So they're really old treasures. I will read The Ragged Trail of Bones. After historical research by Daniel W. Michaels, retired Defense Department analyst and Fulbright scholar. In articles and firsthand texts, I learned that under the Yalta provisions, the US, UK, and Russia agreed to use German prisoners of war in Gulag reparations. Each laborer received a bit of black rye. Productive workers earned a bit of meat, sugar, vegetables, or rice. The last man called to work detail is always shot. Almost 1 million prisoners of war died after a decade of forced labor. Only 10,000 men survived. My father lived. In 1945, Brit and US authorities ordered German militia forces to deport thousands of Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians to Soviet camps. Some were murdered on the spot. Cattle cars transported 9 million prisoners, including my father. Selected women were raped, paraded naked in front of camp officials with promises of easier workloads for sex. 1 out of 3 inmates died the first year. By 1953, 12 to 20 million perished, succumbing to exposure, hunger, exhaustion, and malnutrition. A wooden marker with a deceased inmate's identity was affixed to the left leg. Gold fillings were extracted by praying or cutting. Skulls hammer smashed, chest spiked with metal rods, bodies thrown into unmarked graves. Somehow, father survived Nazi concentration camps and the Stalingrad Gulag, released without any reason. He never mentioned the ordeals his bones harbored. Without question, silence reigned in our home. He spent days in quiet labor at the Solon Medical Office in Bedford, Ohio, and in VA hospitals, doctoring patients to live. I search while the Gulag system disappears from our landscape. What can I do? What can I say but remember to cleanse the empty shoes lining riverbeds? And let us remember the past. Let's not forget. Thank you very much.
Okay.
A shame.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Trying to remove your spotlight here. Let's how do we do that. How do we do that?
We press a button.
Well, that's always finding the button. Here it is.
Right.
That's
You got it.
the difficult part. Our next 2 speakers are from the Ohio Nuclear Free Network. Terry Lodge and Pat Morita, who I wasn't sure could join us, but she just did join us. So we're very excited about that. Are going to speak on Ohio's nuclear legacy. So we'll start with Terry Lodge on Ohio's Manhattan Project ties.
Well, thank you. Greetings from Toledo. Toledo, you Clevelanders are probably aware, is a western suburb of Cleveland. Anyway, I'm happy to be here, participating by Zoom and dry. That picture that you had over your shoulder a few minutes ago, Francis, was horrifying. I remember seeing that in 3D as I was watching on my phone as the rainstorm supposedly was passing to the north of downtown across Lake Erie. But no. I am going to briefly talk and then yield to Pat. I want to talk a little bit about the Ohio history in the Manhattan Project. By way of background, the Manhattan Project, I'm sure all of you are at least generally aware, is the generic name was given to the massive program, scientific and engineering program that launched basically at the commencement of World War II, headed by Corps of Engineers General Leslie Groves, and of course, most recently made infamous again in the movie Oppenheimer. The Manhattan Project was massive. At any given moment, particularly toward the end of World War II, there were probably over 130,000 workers in various capacities in many far-flung geographical locations. Literally hundreds of sites, if you count factories and machining plants and technical offices, as well, of course, as military bases such as Los Alamos, Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, the University of Chicago, the well-remembered Chicago pile, the atomic pile project there that was producing U-235 ultimately for the bomb. There's an incredible legacy that still lingers with us, and of course gave rise after World War II to the proliferation, and I use the word partly as pun, of the Cold War. To just give you, I'm going to just give you a few snapshots of the Ohio history involvement in Manhattan Project. Dozens of states ultimately were affected. There were a number of reasons why there was need for many vendors and many far-flung geographical locations. One was that General Groves and the military wanted to create what they called compartmentalization, to try to keep secret the massive plan to engage in an arms race with the Nazis to develop the bomb. Another was simply that the entire country was on a war footing, and many conventional civil factories and contractors basically converted their facilities and their workforces to providing implements of war, ranging, of course, from jeeps to all kinds of weapons, to artillery. You know, automotive factories were converted in many ways. Refrigerator factories, I famously remember my father talking about how there were refrigerator factories that were manufacturing jeeps, and they didn't last very long after the war. Anyway, there are at least 60 industrial sites across Ohio that had some involvement in the Manhattan Project. I'm going to talk briefly about several of them that still have a radioactive legacy today. You folks in Cleveland would probably be interested, or may even know about, the Harshaw Chemical Company, which was had a Harvard Avenue plant in the Cleveland Flats, where they refined black oxide and sodium diurenate, pardon me, to orange oxide and brown oxide, ultimately for the creation of weapons grade uranium. The final result they generated was called a green salt. It was hexafluoride for enrichment into weapons grade fuel, which was done offsite at gaseous diffusion plants. They also produced uranium hexafluoride throughout the war. And at the peak, we're manufacturing between 1942 and 53 about 4,000 pounds of this green salt, which created a green mist-like atmosphere in the immediate vicinity of the plant, which of course was pollution, and it was radioactive pollution, was deemed at the time certainly a major contributor to urban and downtown pollution in Cleveland. The plant was dismantled commencing in 1953, and hexafluoride production was shifted elsewhere. This plant, of course, is gone, but the site is still there and is still being monitored actively by the Corps of Engineers for radiation. In 2007, an advisory committee to the NRC noted there wasn't enough data or safety protocols in place to determine how much radiation damage employees could have suffered. There are presently plans that are ongoing to excavate and remove thousands of yards of soil, but there are also plans to build an office park, possibly housing on the old site. This is not an uncommon thing, is something that certainly bears close monitoring. the Columbus-based Battelle Memorial Institute, which was founded as an engineering kind of study group, incorporated in the mid-1920s, was engaged in the production at its King Avenue in Columbus and West Jefferson, Ohio facilities. They produced plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. And nowadays, Battelle survives and survives well, managing 9 national weapons producing labs for the US Department of Energy, which is the American weapons program, including Oak Ridge, Savannah River site, and Los Alamos. Interestingly, the West Jefferson site has only in relatively recent years been remediated. Supposedly thousands of yards again of soil were carted off, but there still are fugitive traces I've seen occasionally of plutonium being noted in nearby creeks. And that, of course, signifies another problem in remediation of long-lived radioactive material. It's difficult to locate, difficult to monitor, and once it gets off-site and literally downstream and downwind, you will continue to have problems for thousands of years. Also, in a factory in Columbus, B&T Metals was a significant African-American-owned business that made uranium rods, which were in turn targeted. They were so-called targets, which were slated for being bombarded, particularly by neutrons, in order to create other isotopes, including plutonium. Here in Toledo, Baker Brothers machined uranium rods into slugs for the fuel reactors in Hanford and Oak Ridge to make weapons usable uranium. U-235 is the active ingredient in Fat Man and in conventional atomic bombs, and it is also, of course, of value in hydrogen weapons. The Dayton laboratories produced neutron-generating triggers for the first plutonium bombs developed during World War II. The Monsanto Chemical Company's Central Research Facility lab in Dayton was tasked with producing plutonium for the bombs. Plutonium is used in so-called triggering devices, is an extremely lethal isotope. It has a very short half-life of 140 days or so, but is extremely lethal. It's been said that 1 gram, if it were strategically distributed around the planet, would be capable of inducing radioactive poisoning in 50 million people. And, you know, this is stuff that's manufactured in urban laboratories during World War II. The Mound Laboratories at Miamisburg in Southern Ohio were a premier nuclear weapons maintenance and research complex for more than 50 years. They took over the polonium business from Monsanto. The Plum Brook reactor facility at Sandusky's DOE installation was originally the site of a conventional artillery ammunition plant during World War II, but it immediately at the close of the war and ongoing up to the present became a nuclear research lab. And even now, there are experiments related to development of nuclear-powered rockets, which is the one of the latest developments in the arms race. Nuclear-powered rockets that are incredibly fast, fly very low. Russia has been experimenting and had a nasty accident with one 2 or 3 years ago. So nuclear-powered rockets are the latest and greatest. Also at Plum Brook, there are energy conversion experiments and radioactive effects studies. I will let Pat talk about the last site I'm going to mention, or pardon me, the next to last site, which is the Portsmouth Gaseous Diffusion Plant, also known as PORTS, which is near Piketon, about 80 miles south of Columbus, which for 50 years enriched uranium fuel for nuclear power plants as well as nuclear bombs, and also is doing things contemporarily that involve handling of radioactive material and poisoning the public and workers. The Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, no discussion of Ohio's history of the Manhattan Project would be complete without mentioning this Cincinnati area facility that produced uranium fuel cores that would be converted to plutonium for bombs from the late 40s until 1989. This plant took over the B&T in Columbus, Baker Brothers in Toledo, and Harshaw Chemicals production activities. The different plants at the Fernald complex during that 40-year stretch released millions of pounds of uranium dust into the atmosphere, causing major air and waterborne radioactive contamination out to at least 5 known miles from the complex. There are still very active concerns about the continuing pollution that was caused and terminated 30 years ago. As I listened to Clarissa's very deeply moving passages from her book, I was prompted to think of Faulkner's statement that the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And that is so very true of the World War II era and what we continue to struggle with as the legacy concepts and conflicts. Thank you. Pat?
Pat, before you go, I want to say that we're delighted to have Terry Lodge and Pat Morita here, two very dedicated people who spent a lifetime of activism here. And I just want to share their biographies with you. Terry Lodge is a member of Cleveland Peace Action Board. We're lucky to have him. He's a longtime environmental and civil rights lawyer in Toledo who in his 44 plus years and practicing has represented protesters opposing nuclear power and nuclear weapons, mountaintop removal, fracking, radioactive waste, and war. He values and defends free speech, association, and protest rights of activists above every other constitutional right. And Pat Morita has been an anti-nuclear activist since the 1980s when she served as a volunteer staff person and a board member of the Ohio Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign. For 25 years, she held volunteer positions in the Sierra Club, including chairing the Central Ohio Sierra Club for 9 years, chairing several of their conservation committees, and serving on the Ohio Sierra Club's executive committee. She helped found the Ohio Sierra Club's Nuclear Free Committee in 2010 and served as its chair through 2020. She is currently coordinator with the Ohio Nuclear Free Network, having been a founding member of that organization 2.5 years ago. And Pat is a retired pharmacist living in Columbus, Ohio. So thank you, Pat and Terry. I'm going to find you here and spotlight you. Okay. Thank you, Pat.
Oh, so thank you, everyone. And I presume everyone can hear you. And I'm here right now in Sandusky, where I just, my sister and I just greeted the Golden Rule. So we cannot thank the skipper and the crew and all the people that have helped support the Golden Rule being here in, well, the whole trip, the whole Great Circle, and especially we appreciate what's going on here in Lake Erie. So I'm starting my talk. I'd like to talk about two things that people should really know about nuclear power. And one is that from now on, the public is going to pretty much 100% nearly support it financially because Wall Street won't touch it. So whenever you're talking about jobs, well, just remember that you're going to have to pay for those jobs. And the second thing is the connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And that awesome list, or the gruesome list, I should say, that Terry just talked about, that is just in Ohio, you know. And so between weapons and power, the science is the same, the physics is the same, the funding is the same, the education is the same, the personnel, you know, are the same, and a lot of the processes are the same. So of course, the nuclear industry never wants people to talk about nuclear waste, and so the American public and the American legislators really don't know very much about nuclear waste, generally speaking. And particularly, people don't know about the front end, which is how the plant gets its fuel. But people don't realize that uranium mining, which pretty much wherever it's done around the world, is being done on the lands of indigenous people and poor people where they can just get away with it. Uranium mining, milling, and enrichment, which I'm going to talk about tonight, and which Terry mentioned, and then also fuel fabrication, and then even the building of some nuclear reactors must be built in order to get the waste from which they can then reprocess, from which they can then extract plutonium to make these bombs. So it's just an enormous effort. And a lot of it, of course, the weapons part is all publicly funded. And all throughout this, it's radiation and other pollution is released all throughout all these processes. So at the Portsmouth nuclear site, which is in Piketon, Ohio, which is not actually in Portsmouth, Ohio, but when I'm talking about ports or Portsmouth, I'll be talking about this site. So the site is enormous. It covers 4,000 acres. And in that site, nearly 100 acres under roof of these buildings. These buildings were 85, 65, and 45 feet tall, these 3 large buildings respectively. And it took as much electricity as the city of New York. At the time, the Department of Energy bragged about this to run this plant. And it was called gaseous diffusion was the name of the process. It's a physical process for increasing the amount of fissionable uranium in order to have enough fissionable content to produce nuclear power or nuclear weapons. So when the ore comes out of the ground out in the American West, 3 to 5% of that is uranium. And then when you get the uranium, then less than 1% of that is what they call the 235 isotope, which is the part that they need. So you can see the tiny, tiny, tiny fraction that is needed to make nuclear power, to fuel nuclear power and make nuclear weapons. So to make nuclear power, it has to be 3 to 5% fissionable. That's what the reactors use. For weapons and submarines, it's over 90%. So this is an extremely energy intensive process. And down there at the Portsmouth nuclear site, they brag that it took as much, that they used as much electricity as the city of New York. And they built 2 coal-fired power plants to run that. So you can imagine the global warming that happened from that. So, but the real problem down there was that as the plant was running from the 1950s to about the turn of the century, year 2000, it actually was formally shut down in 2001. From that time, they brought in what they called it by over a dozen different names, including recycled uranium. But it was really high-level radioactive waste that had been reprocessed, and they ran it through the enrichment process in order to extract uranium from that. And so in that process, they contaminated the entire site with plutonium, neptunium, and americium, an awful lot of technetium-99, and all kinds of radioactive components. So during this time, a lot of whistleblowers talked about how they were exposed to all kinds of radioactivity and weren't told about it, all kinds of things that went wrong. It's an infinite supply. And people are still talking about this and complaining, and so many health effects. And I believe that the U.S. The federal workers' compensation has actually paid out $1.2 billion so far for claims from workers at the Portsmouth site. So moving on, in 2019, one of our members of the Ohio Nuclear Free Network, who was recently a member, Dr. Michael Ketterer, and some of you may have heard of him. He is an analytical chemist. He is a retired professor emeritus at Northern Arizona University, where he has access to one of the world's newest and most accurate spectrophotometers. So in 2019, he read the annual site environmental report for 2017, which the Department of Energy conveniently waits almost 2 years to release. And he saw that there was neptunium in an air monitor outside of a middle school there at the Portsmouth site. And so he reported this. And the Department of Energy immediately said, well, this came from atmospheric bomb testing. It certainly didn't come, well, they didn't say it didn't come from the site. They said it came from atmospheric testing. So Dr. Ketterer, of course, had shown with his analysis, in fact, he had proven that it did come from the site. And so there was talk at the Department of Energy that this was fringe science. So we kind of have a joke about Dr. Ketterer and fringe science. But in any case, the school board closed this middle school. And since that time, the Department of Energy has given, I think it's somewhere between $15 and $20 million, and I can't quite remember, to build a new school without acknowledging that there's a problem there with that might have been caused by them. After that, our group, the Ohio Nuclear Free Network, engaged Joseph Mangano, who is the executive director of the Radiation and Public Health Project, and that is in Ocean City, New Jersey. And some of you may have heard of that. It's Joseph Mangano is famous for his studies of strontium in baby teeth. And he had people send in their children's baby teeth, folks that lived around nuclear sites in various places of the country and even other parts of the world. And just to show that indeed, these babies were absorbing strontium-90 and of course other things as well. And they were in their teeth, or they were going to be, at least until those baby teeth were shed. And then, of course, who knows what's going to be in the permanent teeth. So he being an epidemiologist, we engaged him to do a study of health statistics around the Portsmouth nuclear site. And what he came up with shocked even him, because the first study he did was of Pike County alone. And there he found that, well, he studied cancer deaths and premature death rates, all from statistics from the Centers for Disease Control, federal, the US Centers for Disease Control, and the Ohio Department of Health. And what he found that was from their statistics from 1950 to 2000 to 2020, the cancer rate increased by 35%, but the premature death rate increased by 85%, almost double. And I can add that while the Department of Energy acknowledges that certain cancers are caused by radioactivity, that radioactivity really affects every part of the body, the lungs, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, you name it. And so if you have high blood pressure, for instance, it could well be caused by radioactivity, but that's very hard to prove. That's next to impossible to prove. In the same way with these other diseases. So a dramatic increase in premature death rates, and that is from ages 0 to 74. So then more recently, we engaged Joseph Mangano to do a report on 7 counties, including Pike, overall same statistics on 7 counties surrounding the site. And those results were also dramatic, though not quite as dramatic as Pike County. And to do a control, Joe compared 6 counties in Appalachia. This is Appalachian, Ohio we're talking about. There were 6 counties farther east that were really pretty much out of the windshed of the Portsmouth nuclear site. And those had also increased, but not nearly as much. So that's what we're finding there. And we're trying to round up, interest and people and getting after our legislators and getting some action on holding the Department of Energy accountable for this. And then I'll just mention it isn't stopping there. There are 2 new nuclear weapons industries being started up as we speak, both originally done without the required environmental impact statements. The first is, maybe some of you may have heard of HALEU, H-A-L-E-U, high assay low enriched uranium. It's a misnomer because actually when it's 20% fissionable, it is, according to the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it is high enriched uranium. But since they say they are going to make it at the impossibly precise figure of 19.75%. Somehow that makes it low enriched. And one thing we have found out is that it takes a comparatively small amount of energy to enrich it a little further from the 20% to the 90%, a lot less energy. And that makes it a weapons proliferation risk because the United States at 19.75% can also export this, whereas at 20% it's illegal to export. So it's just amazing what the straight face test doesn't really get past here. So this is, not only is it going to make a mess in doing this process, actually, we just found out that the first attempt at this seems to be failing. But so stay tuned. I'm sure they'll fund it much more. They got originally $115 million unbid contract, the company at Portsmouth, which is called American Centrifuge. And they're still, and of course, and then they made the second amount of funding. They made it was for another company to come in and do the same process at the Portsmouth site. So of course, American Centrifuge got the plant, got the American Centrifuge operating, got the American Centrifuge plant contract. The second one is depleted uranium, which is what's left over. It's the 99% of the uranium that's not fissionable, but it's still radioactive. So instead of properly attempting to properly isolate and dispose of it, well, there's a use for it. And that use is making nuclear depleted uranium weapons. And we're talking about shells, armor for tanks, bunker buster bombs. I don't know much of myself about weapons, but as this stuff gets dispersed in the air, where it has been in Iraq and in Afghanistan, probably in Syria, and now both Britain and the United States are sending depleted uranium tanks and probably weapons also to Ukraine. Now, the last thing I'll say about depleted uranium is that it was tested at the Jefferson Proving Ground in southern Indiana, close to where Terry Lodge grew up. Well, the Army since declared that the site was too contaminated to clean up. So with that, I guess I'll stop, and maybe there'll be some time for questions later.
Yes, definitely questions later. Thank you, Pat. As the movie Oppenheimer demonstrated, they were fooling us then, and they're still fooling us. We're going to change a pace here and present you some music. Doug McWilliams and Janie Warner McWilliams have been singing together for 50 years with a rich tradition in the peace movement. They walked across the US in the Great Peace March in 1986, the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament. That's when I first met them. And they walked through Russia after that on the American-Soviet walk to mobilize citizen action to end the nuclear arms race. In the great tradition of folk troubadours, they bring music from those they encountered along the way to add depth to this mission. So I'll let them introduce their songs.
Thank you, Francis. This first song was written in 1986 during the early months of the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament, which Janie and I helped to organize, and some of the participants tonight helped walk across. I see Chris Paul and Joyce Roper, and there may be others who have joined, who participated in this 9-month journey across the United States. But when we entered the Nevada and the St. George, Utah area, it was clear from the people that we encountered and talked to that they had a story to tell with regards to the legacy of nuclear weapons testing on those communities. The people that lived downwind of those atmospheric and later underground testing were experiencing significant health issues. And as we walked through those communities with the Great Peace March, we also carried their stories with us. And I wrote this song called Downwinders, which we're going to share with you. Since we're doing this we're going to use a pre-recorded version that Collective Vision recorded in 1986 as part of their compilation, part of our compilation of music from the Great Peace March. This was inspired by the stories of Gloria Gregerson and Elmer Pickett. Gloria Gregerson lived in Nevada, and Elmer Pickett in St. George, Utah, and their stories are told through the verses of this song. They are also featured in more detail in Howard Ball's book, which I recommend to you, Justice Downwind, America's Atomic Testing Program in the 1950s. Francis, if you could cue the music.
Gloria lived in Bunkerville, a small Nevada town. She would live there still. Gloria turned 12 in 1953, and she played in the dust that fell down from her favorite tree. She wrote Gloria in the dust on the car windows, and went home to eat to dinner she could not have known. 4 years later, the cancer grew. Now Gloria is dead at 42. Gloria, she was a downwinder, but you didn't know hurt her. Downwinder, many more still suffer. Downwinder, who are the downwinders now? Elmer Pickett in St. George, Utah, held the crew from little babe to their great grandpa. My, how things have changed since 1951. when the word came round that the A-bomb testing had begun, and the dust that fell into their lives took away 9 of Mr. Pickett's family ties. And as he mourned the death of his 5-year-old, the government washed their hands and his blood ran cold. Oh, he was a downwinder, but he didn't know hurt her. Downwinder, is there no justice? Downwind, downwinder. Who are the downwinders now? Public outcry, the truth was not told. To avoid delays in the program, they chose to withhold. Instead of being taught how to avoid the harm, families were told there's no cause for alarm. Downwinders, they were the downwinders, but they didn't know hurt them. Downwinders, there's no justice. Downwind, downwinders, what are we downwind from now? Who are the downwinders now? Downwinders, they were the downwinders, but they didn't know hurt them. Downwinders, justice downwind, downwinders, we are the downwinders now.
Wow. I love that song. We're going to move now to another poem by Clarissa Jacobson's. And I should add that Clarissa has read her poems throughout the United States and a couple of times in Paris at the Shakespeare and Company bookstore. She has taught art and poetry in schools as well as Cuyahoga Community College for over 10 years. And this poem is about Hiroshima. Clarissa.
Thank you very much. The poem is called "See the Light Coming Through That Opening." Few survived the passing dawn of Hiroshima, according to Setsuko Thurlow. Teal white magnesium, a fluorescent hue flashes outside my school window. I remember the sensation, the twilight morning of dust and smoke. Silent darkness, floating air beside Black Angel's cloud. Screams of tattered, naked people, burnt strips of skin and flesh. Ribbons hang shaved from bone. Bleeding streams. I follow the procession, stepping over dying whispers of water, please, water. Washing blood, dirt, and stones from my body, I rip dress sleeves at a nearby stream, soaking river's goodness to suckle the dying chorus, shrieking in the background, water, please, water. Purple death spots, black ooze. Pray for the living. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clarissa. The next song we would like to share is called Hibakusha. Hibakusha is a Japanese word that means survivor.
All right, we'd like to share with you some more original music. This next song is a song called Hibakusha. Those of you that were here for the sharing of the Hiroshima peace flame, which Dagmar Celeste took to Columbus with her today. This is a song that was written about the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because that day when we left Los Angeles on March 1st, a woman came and led us in a chant before we left. And she had to say, "No more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki, no more Hibakusha." Maybe we could try that right now, just in preparation for this song. Repeat after me. No more Hiroshima.
No more Hiroshima.
No more Nagasaki.
No more Nagasaki.
And no more Hibakusha.
No more Hibakusha.
And now you know the words to the chorus. You can sing along. No more Hiroshima. No more Nagasaki. No more Hibakusha. We need no more survivors to remind us of the power that we struggle to contain in our blood-stained hands. Woman stood before us, frail and ill at ease. She spoke broken English, she thought in Japanese. Got only glimpses of what she knew firsthand. The horror of the moment we could not comprehend. The story of a girl who watched this wind and sound and light and heat swept everything once familiar from the city streets. And before she left us to think on what we heard, she asked us to chant these words. So we chant these words. No more Hiroshima. No more Nagasaki, no more Hibakusha. We need no more survivors to remind us of the power that we struggle to contain in our blood-stained hands. Weapons, many times the size. Those that terminated 200,000 lives. We now have the choice to change our present course, to live up the vision, to outlive our wars. We carry a piece of the Hiroshima flame. Take it, keep it, let it shine. The brighter the path, the better it is to find. Let it shine. No more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki, no more Hibakusha. We need no more survivors to remind us of the power that we struggle to contain in our blood-stained hands. No more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki, no more Hibakusha. We need no more survivors to remind us of the power that we struggle to contain in our blood-stained hands.
That recording was actually recorded at Edgewater Park in Cleveland when we came through here in 1986. So it has local roots. Thank you.
You want to unshare that? There we go. So the next up on our program is Helen Jacquard, who by a stroke of good fortune just arrived. So maybe she needs to catch her breath or maybe not. Let me introduce Helen here. Helen is an associate, that is to say a non-veteran member of Veterans for Peace and a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She has been both crew and the project manager of the Golden Rule Project since 2015. Helen is a researcher, author, and speaker on the environmental effects of war, militarism, and the nuclear industry. So Helen, let's see if there's the bandwidth here for you to be heard well.
Thank you. Let's give it a try. So I represent the Veterans for Peace and the Golden Rule Project. And this is a boat that the crew tried to stop nuclear weapons testing in 1958. So they, from 1946 to 1958, the US used 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. They produce elements that don't exist in nature. And so there was radiation blowing around the planet and getting into babies' teeth and bones. And everybody was trying to stop the testing. Honolulu a desperate group of people bought a boat and sailed it towards the Marshall Islands. And they made it to Honolulu, resupplied, headed out, and the Coast Guard caught up with them and brought them back and put them under arrest. The arrest of the crew of the Golden Rule brought about such a huge backlash that eventually it convinced Kennedy that he needed to sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. This action also spurred the founding of Greenpeace. Am I coming across okay?
You're doing fine.
Okay. So the boat was sold into private hands and eventually turned up. She sank in a gale in far northern California and was drug up onto the sand into a boatyard, and Veterans for Peace and Quakers and others spent 5 years rebuilding her. I came along right before the Golden Rule was finished with her rebuild in early 2010 and became one of the first crew members. So we sailed up and down the West Coast for 5 years, around the Hawaiian Islands for 2 years. We were trying to get to the Marshall Islands and on to Japan to commemorate the 7th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs. This March of 2020, and nobody was going anywhere because of COVID. So we brought the Golden Rule back to the United States and ultimately decided that we would sail her around the Great Loop. And that's where we met many, many, many wonderful peace activists, including you all. We started in Minneapolis and sailed down the center of the country, around the tip of Florida and to Cuba, up to Portland, Maine and beyond, and back to the Hudson River and through the New York canals into Lake Ontario. Now we're in Lake Erie, headed for Huron and Lake Michigan, and that's where we'll finish our 11,000-mile 13-month voyage to visit 100 different cities to talk about eliminating nuclear weapons and other nuclear issues as well. So some communities are willing to talk about nuclear power. Some understand about uranium mining. A lot of people, they only want to talk about nuclear weapons, but we want to be well versed in all of those things because we know they're all connected. And we know that the whole nuclear industry really needs to just convert itself to clean up. And even at that, the decommissioning industry, particularly Holtec, is not doing well by what it is they're doing by dumping tritium into the waterways. When they're finished with a fuel tank, that's what they do, is empty the water into the waterways. So that's basically what the Golden Rule is doing, and we want to interact with everybody. So if you know of somebody that would like to have a presentation, we are always welcoming the opportunity to do that. I think that's about all I have to say.
Okay. Well, thank you, Helen. It would be fair to say, sailors can navigate by the stars if their equipment is broken these days. But it would be fair to say that the voyage in Lake Erie so far has been a little bit star-crossed. Didn't got to Cleveland a day late, left actually a day late after first planning to leave a day early because of weather. Go figure. We're Clevelanders, we understand this, but we really appreciate the Golden Rule coming here, and we thank Helen and the crew for making a stop in Cleveland. It's helped bring us together, which I think is part of the purpose of the Golden Rule in the first place, is bringing people together to stop the threat of nuclear war, to stop nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and the destruction of our home, which is the planet Earth. I want to next introduce Haley Moran, who is a Jack and Joseph Morton Scholar at Cleveland State University. She is pursuing a major in political science and a minor in criminology. And when she graduates, she hopes to use her knowledge to aid in prison reform. She's going to read a poem, a wonderful poem by Daniel Thompson, who was the first poet laureate of Cleveland and a hardcore activist, if there ever was one. He spoke truth to power, and he was a poet as well. He's gone for some years now, but Haley has volunteered to read his iconic poem, Ground Zero, Downtown Cleveland.
Hello, everybody. I am going to read it, and as he says, it's a wonderful poem. I've been doing research on who Daniel Thompson was, and it's just been amazing to read and see who he was. So, at Ground Zero, the terminal tower is terminated. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument goes AWOL. This Ohio building says sayonara, goes from full serve to no serve in a short-lived moment. Trials at the federal building are postponed. All library fines are canceled. The public library is canceled. At the free speech quadrant, the statue of sedentary mayor Tom L. Johnson is moved for the last time. There is no free speech quadrant. Moses Cleveland makes a landmark decision, packs up his pedestal and flies the coop with his pigeons. Pigeon Mary is out of business. All traffic at Public Square is rerouted through China by way of hell. Straight down through a 300 feet deep chuck hole, Local 1099, representing laborers for the Division of Streets, immediately goes out on strike, demanding more health benefits and hazardous duty pay. Along with other pedestrians, I lie down in the street at Ontario and Euclid and pretend to be alive. I am not arrested by the SWAT team. There is no SWAT team. There is no street. There is no I. There are no pedestrians. There is only pulverization and a crater 1,200 feet in diameter. By now it is obvious to everyone. The poetry has gone out of our lives.
Thank you, Haley. Ground Zero is also a concept that we addressed in some of the songs from the Great Peace March. One of my favorites, which I'm going to ask Francis to play for you now, is one written by my good friend and bandmate, Daryl Purpose, who continues to write songs and tour the United States. It's called Ground Zero. And the chorus, which I encourage you to sing along with, is, I don't want to live zero no more. Francis.
Trouble in the city of the northern Ukraine. Well, all's quiet on the home front about the sick and the lame. Well, there's confusion in my heart as I'm trying to explain about the mindless slaughter of this power game. I don't want to live at ground zero no more. I don't want to push war with my silence. No, I don't want to love fear or to fear love. No more. Ain't gonna push a war with my silence. I'm talking about no more silence now. Ain't gonna push a war with my silence. Talking about talking loudly now. I ain't gonna push a war with my silence. I'm talking about no more.
We ended many concerts with the audience chanting, "No more silence." I encourage you to do the same.
Okay, next up, I do not have a biography for Doug Horner. He was to be the MC and was going to do all these introductions that I'm doing and kind of weave his remarks in at the same time. He did submit a recording that I'm going to play for you right now. No, that's not it. That is not it. Yeah, here it is. Okay, and I'm going to screen share that. And I'll let Doug do the talking. Doug is a pastor in the United Church of Christ, and he's a board member of Cleveland Peace Action.
The story of the Manhattan Project is often told with great gusto about American men and their heroic war-fighting efforts. Preparations for war and defending our country is necessary to preserve the national interests of the United States. I served in the Marine Corps, and I highly respect the men and women who choose to serve their country. Currently, I am a member of Veterans for Peace. So if I had been around in 1945, I would have agreed with the basic premise of the Manhattan Project to make and use a bomb that would turn back the Japanese imperialist aggressors and deter the Nazis from continuing their imperialistic aggression. The Manhattan Project looked idyllic, set in a beautiful town in Los Alamos with white picket fences surrounded by spectacular desert cactuses and canyons. The view from the outside world was perfectly orchestrated, but hindsight is 20/20. Pull back the veil and see a different story: the colonized and racist consequences of the US nuclear weapon development. Most of the uranium was dug from mines in the Belgian Congo, where local indigenous workers were robbed of their lands and resources and health to further the nuclear weapons program. The inhabitants of the lands of New Mexico that became the laboratory, the Native Americans, were forced off. Only a few were able to return as maids and custodians of Los Alamos. The labors of working class women who handled uranium, uninformed about the lasting radiation impacts of their dangerous work, are nearly forgotten. Also forgotten are the stories of several hundred women involved in the project. The Call-Utron girls were a group of young women, many just graduated from high school, who were tasked with separating enriched uranium isotopes on the Call-Utron machines. Female physicists like Isabella Carlisle discovered breakthrough molecular properties that earned her husband a Nobel Peace Prize. Leona Woods Marshall was a vital part of the 47-man, one-woman team who successfully operated Chicago Pile 1, the world's first nuclear reactor. And Lily Hornig fled Nazi Germany and grew up to work on plutonium and explosives in the Manhattan Project. She later advocated for the bomb to never be used against civilian populations. She also remained a fierce advocate for women in science all her life. We think of the Manhattan Project as a man's world, but let us keep in mind the sacrifices of so many more people. So today we remember and honor the land and the people who inhabited these spaces before our arrival and pledge to do better. We also acknowledge that we do battle with the dark powers and principalities in our world and possibly the universe who push for military superiority and US hegemony at the cost of social programs and infrastructure projects. And we also acknowledge that we can do better. The warmongers and neocons can no longer keep these things in the dark. They can cancel whatever books they want, but we know a better way. God's creation is, in fact, full of smart, ingenious, peace-loving, and nonviolent people from every corner of the earth, of every sort, flavor, credo, atheists, agnostics, religions, cults, fads. The universe is founded on a great goodness that energizes all things. I do not just believe this, I know this in my bones. We human beings are supposed to create connections, particle to particle, spiritual being to spiritual being to complete this great goodness. We must work hard and try not to destroy it. And the goodness in me connects with the goodness in you and our friends and our enemies if we want it, if we acknowledge it, if we allow it, we can work for it. And one way we connect with it in a personal way is called contemplation. Other than Christian ways are meditation, yoga, rituals of many sorts like dance, other mental, physical, spiritual, and community building practices. So here's the crux of what I am saying. We must get right with our inner journey of our personal lives. Our ability to work against violence in the world, in our culture, stems from our inner work, is deeply rooted in how we care for ourselves and our planet. Through meditation, yoga, contemplation, whatever you care to practice, you connect with your roots. We can heal ourselves and we can heal others. As creatures, we carry a certain amount of pain from our very birth. If that pain is not healed and transformed, it actually increases as we grow older and we transmit it to people around us. We can become violent in our attitudes, gestures, words, and actions. We must learn from the historical lessons which describe the outcome of our savage nature unchecked, like the biblical story of Cain and Abel, or Isaac and Abraham, or Jesus beaten and hung on the cross to die in front of his mother and followers. We must evolve, turn back violence within us and around us. If we want it, if we acknowledge it, if we allow it, we can work for it. Hollywood keeps giving us violence on the big screen to soothe our savage nature. TV action films and worldwide wrestling, violent games, and people making movies of people watching violent games, violent sports. This we have. These replaced crucifixions, lynchings, public killings, gladiators fighting to the bloody death. Do we need bloody conflicts? Do we need to touch the hem of the violent garment to check the violence within us, keep from internalizing it and grounding us in it? Because violence in our world is compelling as entertainment and has great energy, it has lulled us into a false sense of security. We must acknowledge its power, name it, work on healing it and transforming it into a force for goodness. Also acknowledge that goodness has even more power and energy. Gandhi and King would agree. In Christianity, we call this a radical love. This is the kind of love Jesus models and teaches as described in the gospel or as in the golden rule. Key to it is forgiveness, empathetic awareness. Human life is not about appeasing a vengeful God, but responding to a good and loving God in kind. This from nonviolence trainer Kazu Haga. He says, the work of building the beloved community is understanding that we're not trying to win over people, but to win people over. Historically, winning a war has meant defeating the opponent. In war, there is a clear winner and a clear loser. But in nonviolence, there is no real victory until everyone is on the same side. Dr. King once wrote, "The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community, while the aftermath of violence is tragic bitterness. While violence may be effective in temporarily keeping us safe from harm, it can never create relationships. Violence can never heal the harm that has been done. Violence can never bring about reconciliation. Violence can never create beloved community. Only love can do that." And Richard Rohr says this about violence: "Jesus refused to transmit his pain onto others. The first taste of what I would call mystical nonviolence is that we will not do violence to the infinity of ourselves, that we will not do violence to the God-given, godly nature of life itself. All life is God-given. All life is precious. We must learn to turn our pain into energy for love and passion for healing ourselves and the world. This is a lesson that the Hibakusha have taught us. The Hibakusha, 78 years ago, we created. They're the surviving victims of the atomic bombs which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While these individuals survived the immediate effects of the blast, they have suffered from the effects of radiation sickness, loss of family and friends, discrimination. They are barely acknowledged publicly. 650,000 Japanese people, as well as thousands of Koreans and Japanese Americans, lived in Japan at the time the bomb was dropped. But there are gifts from people like the Hibakusha. They give us the example of living a courageous life. They give us an example that the world know about their suffering so that others do not suffer. They are teachers in cultivating conviction. The Hibakusha are also our teachers in cultivating compassion, that they live through hell on earth and are still able to love and laugh and take joy. This is a sign of the greatest aspects of all of our humanity. Love triumphs over hate. In this rare and precious moment, we still have the time to directly learn from the Hibakusha about courage, conviction, and compassion, and to use our newfound inspiration to take action for disarmament. Because we are in an Oppenheimer moment. The doomsday clock is closer to death. It is more imperative now than ever that we join with others to show the world that there is a way out of this mess. We stand on the shoulders of people like Oppenheimer and Einstein, theoretical physicists for peace. Oppenheimer's feelings changed about his role in conjuring the most destructive force of the age, and he would shift his ideas about bombings after Hiroshima. He took a moral U-turn, stood against building more bombs. For this, he was indicted by the Atomic Energy Commission security panel. He was put on trial, stripped of his security clearance, and humiliated. Oppenheimer joined Einstein in the proverbial timeout corner. I am there also. I want to be there. Maybe you do too. If more of us were there, maybe we wouldn't be having this discussion. The A-bomb changed the world forever. We still live in that world and always will. And here you have the issue. We know too much. And it scares the hell out of me that our president and President Putin and President Zelensky have their fingers next to buttons that can turn the earth into a hellish fireball. And that is why I'm here today. We are not just innocent bystanders in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The US is responsible in the escalation of conflict in subtle and covert operations, but also in outright provocations. Missile silos, military bases, personnel shifts, tiff for tats in the no-fly zones, warmongering propaganda, breaking peace agreements, nuclear treaties being crushed, and causing unrest in Ukraine in 2014 changed the landscape. In fact, we live in democracy if we, the people, have more say in how to develop, build, and use our nuclear arsenals. We must learn from the past so that we don't repeat past mistakes, like creating death and destruction. Einstein said, "The release of the power of the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking. Thus, we drift towards a catastrophe of unparalleled magnitude. Have we learned anything from the Old Testament prophets and stories of Abraham and Isaac, of Cain and Abel, of Jesus being violently taken from the community that was peaceful and nonviolent and put on a cross? Either the world becomes nuclear free or the whole planet becomes a nuclear porcupine. Let's do a 180, a UE, turn back from escalating towards the use of nukes. To quote Einstein again, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Let me give you a little context. Since I am a Christian minister, I thought it might be informative to hear universal wisdom that can be applied across faiths, religions, and theologies from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, beginning at 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to them who beg from you, and do not refuse them who would borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. In another word, what I am saying is grow up. You live in God's kingdom. Now live like it. Live out your God-created identity. Live generously and graciously. These words come from Jesus, who was a Hebrew preacher, prophet, and teacher, and they are common in other faith traditions and religions as well. Dr. William Sloane Coffin was a preacher and chaplain at Yale University and an activist for 30, 40, 50 years, and he was part of an interfaith movement to end war and abolish nuclear weapons. His ideas ring true for us today. Nations are called to confer, not conquer, discuss, not destroy, extend olive branches, not missile ranges. God has the authority to end life on this planet. The only thing human beings have is the power. We have to get the world beyond war. It is not enough to wish for peace. We have to will it, to pray it, to think it, to struggle for peace as if the whole world depended on it, and it does. We should be prepared to resist all reasons advanced for waging war. We need to imagine a world whose citizens will be as mindful of international law as they are of domestic law. We need to imagine a world whose peacekeeping forces will be larger than any national force. We need to imagine a world whose international agencies will be supported by an international income tax based on gross national product or perhaps energy consumption. If we can imagine a world free of violent conflict, free of toxic wastes, one in which the yawning chasm that presently divides the rich from the poor would be greatly narrowed. We can imagine war is over if we want it, says John Lennon and Yoko Ono. If we imagine it, we can put what we want to see into words. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, only above us in the sky. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, only above us, sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one.
Thank you, Doug Horner. We're going to close here with some music from Doug and Janie, and I'm going to show some slides here that are a little tour of what we've been doing this last week. Okay. Don, okay, I'm going to screen share. Doug and Janie, you want to take this home?
Sure. We're going to share with you This Little Light of Mine, which is a song that has great roots in the tradition of the civil rights movement and the peace movement. And we encourage you to sing along. It's better on Zoom if you sing along with your mute button on. And as we sing for you, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Free of fear and hatred, I'm gonna let it shine. Free of fear and hatred, free of fear and hatred, I'm gonna let it shine. Free of fear and hatred, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Building a safer world. Building a safer world. I'm gonna let it shine. Building a safer world. I'm gonna let it shine. Building a safer world. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. No more mass destruction. No more mass destruction. I'm gonna let it shine. No more mass destruction. I'm gonna let it shine. No more mass destruction. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. This little light of mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. 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 Let it shine.